Your world news. Coming up next, our colleagues in the US are getting ready for Bloomberg Daybreak stateside. Let's check in with Nathan Hager. Good morning, Nathan. What lies ahead for you?
Well, Anna, good morning. It may be risk off for investors this morning with coronavirus numbers here, especially in Sunbelt states, hitting new highs in hotspots that tend to be hot this time of year. Dr. Fauci is saying he does not see a let-up this summer when it comes to the spread of COVID-19. At the same time, he is sounding optimistic about a vaccine, perhaps in the next few months. And Washington is sending more signals that fiscal stimulus is on the way. We're going to look at what all this means for investors. Patrick Armstrong of Plurimi Wealth is with us this morning. And we also have our weekly check-in with Andy Pekosh, an immunologist at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We'll get his take on what it's going to take to rebend the curve, a curve that really hasn't bent just yet in southern states. All that and details on the return of baseball to the U.S. coming up with me and Karen Moscow on Bloomberg Daybreak. Hope you'll join us for it. Anna.
Excellent. Yeah, we've had the return of football, soccer, I should probably say, talking to you, Nathan.
Without fans, right?
Very strange, very surreal. Yeah, sort of piped fan music. But apparently it's quiet, actually, if you're pitch side, if you are on the pitch. The sound is just on the TV. Very strange.
We're going to see if there's any fans for the pitching that happens in baseball in the next month or two.
Nathan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bloomberg Daybreak is up next then with Nathan and the team. Or if you're listening on London DAB digital radio, you'll hear Bloomberg Surveillance. Now let's pick up on one of the top stories that Nathan was mentioning, because as the virus spread accelerates across the American South, investors are reconsidering their appetite for risk assets. Joining us now for the last conversation of this hour, Aaron Captain, who is Chief Economist and Global Head of Economic Research at UBS. Aaron, good to speak to you. We sit here with risk assets selling off, down by 1.3%. We'll come at this from an economics perspective, but how do you weigh up the likelihood and the severity, or the potential for severity of a second wave or continuation of a first wave in the United States right now?
Well, the honest answer is no idea, Anna. I think from a market perspective, it doesn't. Obviously, the market needs to reprice sort of these spikes, because it makes you a bit nervous about where we're going. But I think the market ultimately is going to be capped at the bottom by hopes of more treatments and potentially a vaccine, and also I think of a more surgical response to those spikes. So I think really there's this tension now between growth clearly getting better as the economy opens up, and then fear of locking down again. I think the market is fundamentally making a bet that the lockdown is going to look very, very different next time around if there is that second wave spike.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. None of us knows exactly what's going to happen, do we here, Aaron? But yes, I hear from a number of guests that they expect something more forensic, as you put it, more sort of what is the word? Less of a policy for the whole economy and more of a targeted. That's the word I was looking for. Targeted approach for various places. Does it influence? Well, what are you thinking of in terms of the U.S. growth story then from here? We've heard a lot of people weighing in. Is it possible to have a view on the U.S. growth story?
I think it is in one respect. So clearly, we have the mobility data. We're now getting the PMI data. I think that's all sort of confirming what we think we know, which is that the economy is responding more quickly to the easing of restrictions than we expected. And the U.S. is an interesting one, because if you look at, for instance, the Oxford Stringency Index that sort of tries to measure across countries how restrictive things are, then on paper, the U.S. is still quite restrictive, and yet the economic data is getting better very rapidly. So I think it's sort of clear that Q2 is looking less bad than many people expected. We've taken our own numbers down from minus 40% annualized growth to something like minus 30. So there's no real question over the sharpness of the rebound that's happening into quarter. I think the uncertainty is really, let's imagine that we go back to 70 or 80% of normal demand. At that level of normalcy, we don't actually know how many sectors are viable. And so in thinking about what the second half of the year looks like, I think there's still enormous uncertainty about the shape of the recovery trajectory. So it's one thing to sort of say, great, things are getting better. That's about as much as we could have hoped for. But we really still don't know how to extrapolate, for instance, the recent gains in retail sales and payrolls.
And with that in mind, what kind of response will we need to see from the Fed then, Aaron? I mean, will yield curve control, holding down interest rates at specific levels on specific parts of the forward curve, will that be necessary? Or will just giving forward guidance that rates aren't going anywhere in a hurry, will that be enough?
Yeah, so it's quite surprising they punted on that at the last meeting, because effectively their own dot plot says they're not going to hike until 2023 or so at the earliest. And their own forecasts sort of imply that they really are super, super cautious on the outlook, and yet they backed away from just codifying that in forward guidance language to just confirm that to the markets, and then to have yield curve control to sort of reinforce that forward guidance. So that was sort of our expectation, that they would do some short-term yield curve control, basically out to 3 years, to lock in that notion that they're not hiking. And I think what really happened is payrolls. So the payrolls were such a surprise for everyone, including the Fed, that I think they said, wow, we really know even less about what's happening in the economy than we thought. And why don't we wait another meeting, another couple meetings, just to gather more evidence before we maybe go down the route of yield curve control and forward guidance. But they've definitely exited, I think, emergency mode. So I think all the central banks, including the Fed, are trying to settle into something that is a long-term, multi-year, easy monetary stance, and they're trying to sort of define the elements which will frame that.
Yeah, not in emergency mode, but with a big emergency balance sheet, maybe still. What about the fiscal side of things? The Trump administration, we learned from Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin yesterday, is discussing another stimulus package with lawmakers. What should they bear in mind to make sure that the transmission of the maximum amount of benefit from that fiscal stimulus into the broader economy is captured?
Yeah, so there's two things there. So we penciled in something like $750 billion in new fiscal spending. A lot of that focus on infrastructure, which they haven't really done yet. So the first phase of stimulus was focused on containing the Q2 damage. The next phase is going to be on working down an unemployment spike. I don't think the infrastructure is going to be that controversial. I think what's going to be controversial is the same things as in Europe. So the generosity of the unemployment benefits, the $600 a week, whether you remove that or not. And of course, what's now a problem is that as the economy and the economic data is getting better, the narrative changes. So when you're suddenly posting millions of payroll gains, it actually sort of takes the momentum a little bit out of that fiscal debate.
Aaron, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Aaron Captain, Chief Economist and Global Head of Economic Research at UBS. Next up, Daybreak with Nathan Hager and Karen Moscow. Or if you're listening in London on DAB Digital Radio, you'll hear Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keane and Francine Lacroix. European equity markets selling off this morning, down by 1.3% as we get ready to hand over to the US. US futures point downward. The Nasdaq, though, outperforms just a touch. This is Bloomberg.
Decisions. Clearing. Isn't it great? So much choice. But hey, listening to me on your desktop isn't getting anything done. You need to take this Wednesday morning by the scruff of the neck. Take this sunshine as an omen and carve your path to success, which begins just down the road in Southampton at Solent University. After 3 years here, you don't just get a degree. You get a ton of support, real-world experience and connections, and interview fuel. That's why we're in the top 25 for student satisfaction in the Complete University Guide. At Solent University, we're ready for the future. Apply now at solent.ac.uk/clearing.
You know that feeling when you get more than you expected? Like when your week off is forecast warm and sunny. Or when there's an extra unclaimed sausage left on the barbecue. Or joining Tesco Mobile and finding out you get the latest phones and 99% UK network coverage. Yeah, that feeling. Nice, isn't it? Tesco Mobile. Every little helps.
99% 4G population coverage indoors and outdoors across UK.
24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studios, this is Bloomberg Daybreak for Wednesday, June 24th, 2020. Coming up this hour.
U.S. futures fall as coronavirus infections surge in several states.
Cases in Texas and California hit record highs as Florida sees its infection rate hit double digits.
The nation's top infectious disease expert sounds the alarm, calling the coming weeks critical to stop the outbreak.
It could be days or weeks before we get the results of yesterday's primaries. New York City and New Jersey are ready to open their beaches and water parks. I'm Amy Morris. More ahead.
I'm John Stashower on sports. Baseball players head to their home cities for spring training next week, and a big name added to the list of athletes to test positive for coronavirus.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Good morning. I'm Karen Moscow.
I'm Nathan Hager. Bloomberg Daybreak brought to you by SEI. Crises and challenges highlight the power of partnership and character. Work for the common good. One community, SEI. Go to SEIC.com/banks.
And U.S. futures are falling this morning, 5:01 on Wall Street, and we check the markets every 15 minutes throughout the trading day on Bloomberg. S&P futures down 20 points, Dow futures down 183, NASDAQ futures down 36. The DAX in Germany is down 1.7%. So is the FTSE 100, CAC in Paris down 1.5%. 10-year Treasury up 1/32, the yield 0.70%. Yield on the 2-year 0.19%. NYMEX crude oil down 1.5% or 59 cents at $39.78 a barrel. COMEX gold up 0.6% or $10.20 at $17.92 an ounce. Nathan.
Karen, hotspots in the U.S. continue to see a surge in coronavirus cases. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis says the infection rate has climbed above 10%.
What we've seen, particularly over the last week, is a real explosion in new cases amongst our younger demographics.
In Texas, daily infections hit a record with more than 5,000 new cases. Pablo Vasquez is director of nursing for the highly infectious disease unit at Houston Methodist.
Probably over this last week is when we have seen the fastest growing number of COVID positive patients that we're seeing through our Houston Methodist doors.
California also reported its biggest jump in cases. Even New Jersey is showing warning signs.
The number of patients in either critical or intensive care was 307. Number of ventilators in use was 216. Each of these metrics is a slight increase from the day before.
Governor Phil Murphy says New Jersey's rate of transmission is starting to creep up. He warns residents not to let a single-day increase turn into a trend.
The surge is a disturbing trend, according to the nation's top infectious disease expert.
Right now, the next couple of weeks are going to be critical in our ability to address those surgings that we're seeing in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, and in other states.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is concerned about the increase in community spread. At the same time, he's optimistic.
When and not if we get favorable candidates with good results, we will be able to make them available to the American public.
2 weeks. That follows similar comments from the Assistant Health Secretary and the FDA Commissioner, who say it's been some time since they've spoken to the...
John Stashower joins us now with details. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Nathan and Karen. The two sides of the labor dispute that put off the start of the season never did come to an agreement, but Commissioner Rob Manfred imposed the 60-game schedule, and they did agree yesterday on final health and safety protocols. So next week will be the resumption of spring training, opening day either July 23rd or 24th, all practices and games to be held at teams' empty home stadiums. More details coming up in 5 minutes in sports. I'm John Stashower, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, John, thank you. In New York City, it's day 3 of the Phase 2 reopening process. Theoretically, the city's vast finance industry is open for business, but only a few employees are back at the office. We get more from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
By all indications, it'll be a slow slog. Citigroup, for example, has just a few dozen bankers in its Lower Manhattan tower. Royal Bank of Canada's capital markets business in New York has just 17 people, and Blackstone Group does not plan to open offices even to a small subset of its 2,200 employees until next month. Carlyle Group has told staff in New York to wait until at least September. Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, Charlie, thanks. As companies remain cautious and infections spread, the government is eyeing another round of stimulus. A package could come as soon as July, according to Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. He spoke at day 2 of the Bloomberg Invest Global Conference.
We are beginning to discuss the different aspects of what another bill would look like. We want to take our time because, number one, there's a lot of money we still haven't put out. And number two, we want to make sure whatever we do going forward is much more targeted to the businesses that are most impacted.
Sources say the White House has privately discussed a $1 trillion stimulus package. And while that's not a certainty, Mnuchin says it's under serious consideration.
Now another $1 trillion question. How quickly will the economy recover? Joining us live with a wide range of answers is Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
Yeah, Karen, let's start with the prediction from Treasury Secretary Mnuchin.
The economy had a very bad second quarter. I think you're going to see a spectacular rebound off the bottom in the third quarter.
Mnuchin sees the U.S. exiting recession by year's end. Meantime, the head of PIMCO doesn't expect a full recovery for another year and a half.
We expect real GDP to come back to the 2019 level by the end of 2021.
PIMCO CEO Manny Roman sees the Fed keeping rates unchanged for a very long time. The head of Carlyle Group predicts an uneven recovery. Co-CEO Kaesong Lee doesn't see a return to pre-pandemic levels for several years.
I do think the resiliency of our economy is such that we'll power through this, but it's not going to be a classic V-shape.
Those comments courtesy of the Bloomberg Invest Global Conference. Stay tuned for more from the event today, including interviews with Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon and interviews with Bridgewater Associates Co-Chief Investment Officer Bob Prince coming up at 1 p.m. Wall Street time. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, John, thank you. And futures this morning are lower. S&P futures down 21 points. Dow futures down 196. And NASDAQ futures down 37. 10-year Treasury little change. Yield 0.71%. Straight ahead, we have the latest world and national news. And this is Bloomberg.
All right, Karen, thank you. It's 5:07 on Wall Street. Let's bring in Amy Morris now for more of what's going on around the world. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning, Nathan. It could be July before we find out who won some of yesterday's primary elections. Thanks to the coronavirus, hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots have yet to be counted. In New York, 1.8 million people requested absentee ballots by mid-June. Voters who did go to the polls say there were some scattered problems with incomplete ballots in poll sites opening late. When some polls closed at 9 o'clock last night, there were still reports of very long lines in suburbs north of New York City. We do know that Joe Biden won the New York Democratic primary for president, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won her primary in parts of Queens and the Bronx. And the latest New York Times Siena College poll shows Biden leading President Trump nationally 50 to 36%. Meanwhile, veteran House Democrat Eliot Engel risks falling to a strong challenge from progressive newcomer Jamal Bowman. Bowman assumed victory as he addressed supporters last night, but he does concede that the outcome is not yet decided. In other news, New York City is moving forward on its reopening plans. Beaches are next. Mayor Bill de Blasio's office says the formal announcement is expected later today, but to expect those beaches to reopen on July 1st. In addition, the city has new street parking rules taking effect on June 29th to limit alternate side parking. Long Island graduates to phase 3 starting today with the return of indoor dining and other personal care services. Some restrictions, of course, will remain in place. And New Jersey is positioning itself to enter the latter part of phase 2 of its reopening. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy says they'll be reopening water parks and amusement parks on July 2nd with those restrictions.
Capacity constraints, face coverings, heightened hygiene, social distancing, that you should expect, folks, those are part of the norm going forward.
They'll release a timeline for indoor recreation like arcades later today. Also, in New Jersey, the state workers union has struck a deal with Governor Murphy to postpone annual raises and furlough workers to avoid layoffs.
I thank CWA's leaders and employees for coming to the table in partnership to address this reality while ensuring that as many New Jerseyans as possible remain gainfully employed.
The agreement is subject to employee ratification. That vote is expected later this week. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg. Nathan.
All right, Amy, thank you. 5:09 on Wall Street. Time for the Bloomberg Sports Update. John Stashower. We finally have a deal.
Yeah, Nathan, and when we last saw baseball, teams had a couple of weeks of spring training left. So next week comes spring training 2.0, not in Florida and Arizona. That's been scrapped. Due to COVID concerns, those states' cases are spiking, so players will train in their empty home stadiums, and that's where the games will be played starting July 23rd or 24th. The regular season will last 60 games, end in late September. The playoffs were going to be expanded, but since there was never a labor agreement, now they won't be. A major development in the story about the noose found at Talladega in the garage of NASCAR's only black driver, Bubba Wallace. As someone once said, never mind, it wasn't a noose. It was a rope that was used to pull down the garage, and it had been there since last fall. NASCAR called it the best outcome possible. The list of sports figures to get coronavirus continues to grow. Add Novak Djokovic, the number one tennis player in the world, winner of 17 Grand Slams. He recently ran some exhibition matches in his native Croatia. Apparently, there were no COVID precautions taken. Grigor Dimitrov, a top 20 player, tested positive there, and now so has Djokovic and his wife. And another Serb NBA All-Star, Nikola Jokic of the Denver Nuggets, has tested positive. His return to the U.S. for the NBA restart will be postponed. Where will the Rangers and Islanders be heading for the NHL restart? The list of cities being considered to host games was cut from 9 to 6. Out are Pittsburgh, Dallas, and Columbus. Still in Chicago, Vegas, L.A., Toronto, Edmonton, and Vancouver. 2 of the 6 will be chosen. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Nathan.
And John Marge Schott, the controversial former owner of the Cincinnati Reds, is having her name removed from the University of Cincinnati baseball stadium amid the national push for racial justice sparked by George Floyd's death. Schott was repeatedly suspended and ultimately removed by Major League Baseball for her racial slurs and praise of Adolf Hitler, and was